The first 9 chapters of Proverbs have a theme running through them. It's this phrase, my son, that Solomon seems to be saying, we said likely to Jeroboam, although there is certainly a connection in God saying to Solomon, my son, and God therefore speaking through Solomon because God had said that Solomon would be the one to sit on David's throne as David's son. And there is a third connection, maybe a third level to this, in that Jesus himself is wisdom personified. And so God is saying to Jesus, my son, act in these ways. And Jesus accordingly lived perfectly a wise life and credited it to you as part of your righteousness before God. But what the commentator of our commentary wants to let us know is that those times when the phrase my son come up are actually connecting the wisdom of these first 9 chapters to the 10 commandments. He says there are 10 times where the phrase my son shows up. And each of those 10 times is wisdom particularly connected to the 10 commandments. And so the overarching theme here is that wisdom really can be boiled down to the 10 commandments. Now, I'm doing a series right now on our YouTube channel called Teaching the Catechism, where I'm walking through the 10 commandments at, I would say, like a medium depth level. And so I would encourage you to follow along with that series so that you can hear what the 10 commandments have to say in some more detail. Or if you really want to go on a deep dive, we do a class called Growing in Grace and Knowledge that I can do either online or in person, as we're allowed to do that. And that is a deep dive on the commandments where we're spending an hour or so on 1 or 2 commandments, really digging through the weeds on what it means to follow these commandments. But you can just know them as those 10 words that God has spoken. No other gods, not using his name in vain, remembering his Sabbath day, honoring your authority, not murdering, not committing adultery or stealing, bearing false testimony or coveting. And so what the commentator wants us to do is see these 10 my son statements in that context. And so what I'm going to do for you is actually just read right from his commentary because he summarizes these things really well. So if you need to go back and listen to this again after I read it, I would encourage you to do that. It's the beauty of YouTube or podcasts. But here we go. He says, since each of the 10, that's the 10 statements of my son, addresses calls on the son to heed his father's instruction, they all encourage observance of the 4th commandment. In addition, each calls on the son to contemplate specific applications of the Decalogue. Decalogue is another term for the 10 commandments. The first address advises the son to avoid the company of sinners because that they might lead him to shed blood and steal, which are the 5th and the 7th commandments. The second address advises the son especially to avoid adultery, which is the 6th commandment. The third address advises the son to trust Yahweh with all his heart, a summary of the first table of the law, or the first 3 commandments. The fourth address advises the son to treat his neighbor properly, a summary of the second table of the law, or the last 7 commandments. The 5th address commands the son to stay away from the path of wicked people, encompassing all 10 commandments, which you should compare to Psalm 1 verses 1 and 2, where avoidance of wicked people is linked to observance of the entire Torah, or the entire 10 commandments. The 6th address not only advises the son to avoid evil in general, but chapter 4 verse 24 also pointedly commands him to avoid dishonesty and deceptive speech, which is the 8th commandment. The 7th address, like the 2nd, 9th, and 10th addresses, warns against the danger of adultery. The 8th address has 4 subsections. First, 6 verses 1 to 5 advises against financial entanglements that can tempt one to break the 7th commandment. Second, chapter 6 verses 6 to 11 warns against laziness, which can lead to poverty and the temptation to break the 7th commandment. Third, chapter 6 verses 12 to 15 cautions against dishonesty, which is the 8th commandment. Fourth, the 7 abominations in chapter 6, verse 16 to 19 include offenses against the 5th and 8th commandments, and also sins of the heart, which are the 9th and 10th commandments. The 9th address, once again, chapter 6, verses 20 to 35, once again warns against breaking the 6th commandment, and it is the only one of the 10 addresses that uses the same verb for commit adultery as the command through Moses in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. The 10th address, it's just chapter 7, verses 1 to 27, is the 4th warning against adultery and violating the 6th commandment. These 10 addresses, then, cover the entire 10 Commandments and are designed to lead the reader to conclude that Solomon's counsel is not simply human advice, but divine wisdom for life, that the reader may have life and have it abundantly, to quote John 10. These 10 addresses contain instructions for life in human society. While most of them focus on commandments from the second table of the law, or the last 7 commandments, they presuppose the first table of the law, or the first 3 commandments. The first and second tables of the law are summarized by Jesus in what he calls the great and first commandment and the second, respectively. All 10 of the addresses emphasize wisdom for believers not living just in the world, but among and within the whole people of God in a community redeemed by grace. So if you understand the 10 Commandments to not just be God's rules for life, but his blueprint for what the world was supposed to be, and therefore what we as redeemed Christians living free from the obligations of the law can do to sort of, in a way, restore that beautiful society that God has given us, then you will see these commands for wisdom to be in line with that as well. One last piece on this before we close up on this idea of the statements of my son in the 10 Commandments. You'll notice that the 6th commandment of adultery comes up quite a bit. And I think there are 2 ways you can go to understand why that comes up so often, and I think they're both valuable. On the one hand, you can say sexual sin is particularly destructive in a person's life. Obviously, if you murder somebody or if you steal somebody, there may be some intense ramifications on your life. But when it comes to sexual sin, you're not just putting yourself in a bad spot, you're actually hurting your own body, is what Paul would say in 1 Corinthians 6. If a man sins sexually, he sins against his own body. See, the other commandments, they have external consequences, but the 6th commandment, the commandment against adultery or sexual sin, has internal consequences. And that means it should be particularly avoided. Now, I'm sure that many of you are thinking, wow, Christianity has overplayed their hand on sexuality in the past, and maybe they have. But it's not because the Bible doesn't think that this is an important issue to talk about. The second reason would be that God equates unfaithfulness to him with adultery. He uses this picture throughout the Old Testament, especially think maybe of the book of Hosea, where God says that his people have been like a prostitute who have gone around and whored themselves out to all the other gods of all the other nations while he has remained faithful to them. And so while this is definitely talking about like actual sexual sin in your life, it is also talking about the unfaithfulness to God that is the primary temptation of Satan. Satan cares less if you murder somebody or steal something than if you're actually going to leave God, be unfaithful to God. That's what he wants more than anything else. And so see the focus on the 6th commandment as sort of a double entendre. Yeah, it's about your life and about your sexual purity, but it's also about your faithfulness to God. And then remember that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, which is to say not only that you should have fear that breaking God's law would be a bad thing, although it would be, but that you also understand that God has redeemed you. And if you have a messed up sexual past, if you're dealing with the feelings or the psychological trauma of something that somebody else did to you sexually, you can know this: Christ has redeemed you. He promises you a brand new, resurrected, glorified body in heaven. That is waiting for you. That is guaranteed. And so, yeah, you're going to live in this body that is subject to death until that time when he resurrects you. But you have that promise. And so even if your past is messed up, you're forgiven, you're made new in Christ, and you can live according to these pieces of wisdom about the 6th commandment moving forward. So let's get back into the text next time and understand that what we're going to study for the first 9 chapters is really just the 10 commandments, just spoken in maybe more flowery language. We'll see you next time.